Why did Mexico say, "We can't pay"? That one sentence, calm, almost resigned, was enough to send the world's financial system into shock. Banks panicked, governments froze. And in the heart of Mexico City, a nation's pride cracked under the weight of impossible numbers. This is the story of 1982, the night Mexico's economy stopped breathing. A story of oil, ambition, and the moment when optimism turned to chaos. So, let me ask you something. What happens when a country borrows so much that even its future is no longer its own? Because on that August day in 1982, Mexico wasn't just broke, it was trapped. And its cry for help would echo across the entire developing world. Welcome to Financial History Uncovered. If you love stories of empires, money, and collapse, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is just the beginning. It all began with a dream that Mexico could rise from the past and stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's great powers. Through the 1970s, the streets of Mexico City shimmered with new ambition. Oil discoveries in the Gulf of Mexico promised a golden future. Money flowed, confidence soared. The government borrowed billions, convinced that the nation's new oil wealth would pay for everything: schools, roads, housing, and the modernization of an entire economy. Every well drilled seemed to promise another miracle, and international banks, swimming in petrodollars from the oil exporting world, were desperate to lend. Loans came easy, interest rates were low. It felt safe, almost too safe. Mexican leaders called it El Milagro Mexicano, the Mexican miracle. The country was growing faster than ever before. And in the tall glass towers of New York, bankers raised champagne to the miracle they believed would never end. But as with every miracle built on debt, the magic wouldn't last. By 1979, something began to shift. In Washington, a man named Paul Volcker took the helm of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And he had one mission: kill inflation no matter the cost. To do it, he did something unthinkable. He raised interest rates, not by a little, but by a lot. Almost overnight, the world's borrowing costs tripled. Loans that had once been cheap became crushing. And Mexico, like much of Latin America, suddenly owed far more than it had ever planned. But that wasn't the only blow. Oil prices, which had fueled Mexico's dream, began to fall. The world was producing too much. Demand slowed. The cash that was supposed to pay off Mexico's loans evaporated. And yet, the government kept borrowing, because what else could it do? Stopping meant collapse. Continuing meant disaster. So, let me ask you something. What would you do if your entire nation was living off borrowed time? In 1981, Mexico's debt reached $80 billion, an unimaginable figure at the time. But still, officials insisted everything was fine. They said oil exports would save them. Behind closed doors, though, panic was spreading. Every month, it became harder to pay the interest on the loans. Each time the peso fell, the cost of repayment grew heavier. And in the summer of 1982, the truth finally broke through the lies. Jesus Silva Herzog, Mexico's Minister of Finance, sat in his office surrounded by papers, telegrams, and numbers that made no sense anymore. The banks were calling, payments were due. The country was out of money. In Washington, U.S. officials began hearing whispers. Mexico might default. And on August 12, 1982, the whispers became history. Silva Herzog called the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury. His voice was steady but cold. Mexico, he said, cannot meet its obligations. We can't pay. Those 4 words, "we can't pay," sent tremors through the world's financial system. Within hours, phones rang from New York to London to Tokyo. The world's biggest banks realized the unthinkable. Mexico's collapse could drag them all down. Citibank, Chase, and hundreds of others had lent billions to Mexico. If Mexico couldn't pay, who could? Investors panicked, lenders froze credit. And across Latin America, other nations that had borrowed heavily began to sweat. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela. They all owed billions, too. Mexico's fall had lit a fuse. But in Mexico City, the streets told a different story. Ordinary people didn't yet know what had happened. The peso had been devalued, inflation was surging. But no one understood the scale of the storm that was about to hit. Factories slowed, imports stopped. Supermarkets emptied, the miracle was over. President José López Portillo went on national television. His face was tired, his tone defiant. He announced something few saw coming: Mexico would nationalize its banks. Every private bank in the country was taken over by the government. To many Mexicans, it felt like revenge against the rich. To the world, it looked like desperation. Foreign investors fled overnight. Capital controls were imposed. And the peso, once a symbol of pride, was in free fall. The message was clear. Mexico was in crisis. And that crisis had no easy fix. Meanwhile, in Washington, panic had turned into action. The U.S. Treasury, the IMF, and the world's major banks rushed to design an emergency rescue. They couldn't let Mexico fail completely. If it did, hundreds of banks could collapse, and the global system might unravel. But the money wouldn't come for free. The IMF stepped in with loans, but demanded brutal conditions in return. Mexico had to slash public spending, end subsidies, raise taxes, and open its markets to foreign trade. The country that once dreamed of independence was now living under IMF supervision. Austerity hit hard, prices soared, salaries froze, unemployment rose. Families who had once believed in the promise of oil now stood in food lines. A generation that had grown up believing in the Mexican miracle was waking up in a nightmare. So, was this the price of borrowing too much? Or the punishment of a system designed to protect the lenders, not the people? By 1983, the panic had spread across Latin America. Dozens of countries lined up behind Mexico, begging for debt relief. The banks called it the developing world debt crisis. But for millions of people, it was simply the lost decade. The 1980s would become known as La Década Perdida, the decade lost to inflation, stagnation, and despair. Factories closed, currencies collapsed. Hope disappeared. And through it all, Mexico kept paying, interest after interest, year after year, just to avoid being cut off completely. Imagine working every day, not to build your future, but to pay for your past. That was Mexico's reality. Years passed. Governments changed, but the debt remained. It was a chain the country couldn't break, until 1989. That's when U.S. Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady proposed a new plan, the Brady Plan. It was a radical idea. Let countries exchange their old, unpayable debt for new bonds, with reduced value and longer terms. For Mexico, it was salvation. Finally, a way out of the spiral. After 7 years of austerity, suffering, and humiliation, the country could breathe again. Debt was reduced. Growth slowly returned. But the scars would last for generations. By the early 1990s, Mexico had transformed. The country that once nationalized its banks now embraced free markets. It privatized industries, cut tariffs, and signed trade deals, including what would become NAFTA. Foreign investors returned. The economy opened. But the lessons of 1982 never truly faded. Because Mexico had learned the hard way that prosperity built on borrowed money is a ticking bomb. And once it explodes, recovery takes not years, but decades. And so let's step back for a second. How did it all happen? How did one of Latin America's brightest economies turn into a cautionary tale for the world? It wasn't greed alone, it was confidence. It was faith. The belief that tomorrow would always be richer than today. When oil money flowed, Mexico believed it was unstoppable. When banks lined up to lend, no one asked what would happen if the tide turned. And when it finally did, everyone paid the price. Today, economists still study 1982 as the beginning of the modern debt crisis era. It exposed how fragile the global system was, how a single nation's default could threaten the entire world. It also showed something else, that once confidence breaks, it takes years to rebuild. Because in the end, economies run not just on money, but on trust. And in 1982, trust itself collapsed. Mexico survived, it adapted, but the ghosts of that year still whisper through every debt negotiation, every IMF loan, every promise of reform. When Argentina defaulted in 2001, when Greece faced its crisis in 2010, the echoes of Mexico were there. The same pattern, the same fear, the same question. How much debt is too much? Because history has a cruel rhythm. Nations rise, they borrow, they shine, and then they break. Each time believing, this time is different. But it never is. The 1982 crisis wasn't just about Mexico. It was about all of us. About how power, greed, and hope can blind entire systems. And maybe, just maybe, about how the world keeps forgetting its own warnings. So why did Mexico say we can't pay? Because it couldn't. Because it was trapped in a storm that no one, not bankers, not politicians, not even economists, truly understood until it was too late. It said we can't pay because pride had met reality, because the dream had become a debt, and because sometimes survival means admitting defeat. This was 1982, when Mexico said, "We can't pay." A story of ambition, collapse, and the moment a nation stood before the world and whispered the truth it could no longer hide. If you want to uncover more stories where money, history, and power collide, subscribe now and join me for the next episode of Financial History Uncovered. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.